Hi,
Okay.
everybody. My name's Michelle Miller, and I'm from the Asia Research Institute, which is the hosting institute for this panel on ethics and theory. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this panel. I'd like to say good morning. I think it's still morning in Paris. Good afternoon in Bangkok and other parts of Southeast Asia. And good evening. We're just moving into evening here in Singapore and further south. Today's panel will be hosted by Professor Mona Lilja from the University of Gothenburg. And we have 4 panelists today. There'll be 45 to 60 minutes of presentations, followed by question and answer. I should let you know that this session will be recorded, and I would like to now introduce Professor Lilja. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me share this panel. I'm very excited about it. And well, as already has been said here, this panel is about ethical dimensions in socially engaged research, more or less. And we will discuss how, where, and when we do communicate about social movements in a respectful way, but a way that also corresponds to academics' expectations. And we will discuss different ethical dilemmas that are included when we do research about, for example, social movements. And we have 4 presentations and 4 interesting scholars that will present today. And I'm thinking that I will start to introduce our speakers, and then we will have the presentations. Thereafter, I will summarize a bit about the presentations and also ask the presenters some questions. And thereafter, we will open up the floor for more general questions. So that is how we will proceed today. And we have among our presenters, Ikra Anugrah. I hope I pronounced that in right. Let's see. And you are an affiliated researcher at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University.
That's correct.
And also, yeah, that's right. And also a researcher at the Institute for Economic and Social Research, Education and Information. I hope I got that right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we also have Paul Francois Tremlett. Maybe I should just stop there and we'll take the presentations as we go. Would that be? Yeah. And we can just start with your presentation, Ikra.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Lilja and colleagues who joined this session. I'm Ikra Anugrah, an affiliated researcher at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. Let me share screen my presentation first. All right. So I hope everyone is able to see my slides right now, and excuse me. I hope everyone can hear me clearly, and if I speak too fast or if there's any connection interruption, please let me know. I'm based at Kyoto University, but I'm also based at LP3S, the institute in Jakarta, Indonesia, like many other colleagues here. And currently I'm actually in Amsterdam. I'm doing a visiting fellowship at KITLV in Leiden. And this is a sort of side project or a reflection of my research and community engagement activities over the past 7 years. And really it's in an attempt to take a critical distance of what I'm doing and also to criticize myself as a social movement researcher, I would say to mock and ridicule myself in a critical way and think about issues inherent in knowledge production and engagement activities as social movement scholars. So to give you some context here, my background is I'm a researcher of social movements in Indonesia. I would describe myself as a scholar activist with multiple hats and commitments in different research and social movement sectors and activities. And I also have multiple livelihood sources and employment gigs. And I've been more specifically in the context of my research, I've been conducting research on agrarian movements since 2015. I also have a number of other side projects, but agrarian movements in post-authoritarian Indonesia has been my primary research topic over the past 7 years or so. And my argument here is pretty simple, actually, is that social movement scholars are not only fellow fighters in social movement struggles or struggles for social justice and the like, but there's also a not so hidden side of these scholars in that sometimes they also benefit from this process. They are also surplus value appropriators, benefiting from their research and activities or community engagement activities. So that would be my argument in a nutshell. And I won't bore you with too much details about the political economy of academia in maybe in the past 20, 30, 40 decades, 40 years or so. But let me just give you some context about how the landscape of academia has been changing over the past decades. I would like to highlight that more and more there is a rising rate of class differentiation among academics. So these are some figures, some numbers from the United States, but I think this will also apply in many other countries, including in Indonesia. You can see that the number of full-time tenured faculty or tenure-track faculty has been declining since the 1970s. And now we have more and more non-tenure-track faculty, adjunct faculties, basically faculty members with a more precarious employment status, right? And academia, an academic job has been shifting basically from a craft or calling to a career in which you're pressured to operate as an effective producers, right? And this is also true in Indonesia. This is data from the Ministry of Education and Culture, from their Higher Education Statistics Handbook. And in it, the ministry records that, well, assuming that this data is correct and valid, that approximately 88% of faculty members in Indonesia are non-tenure track faculty members, right? And the broader problem, the broader political economic context, the broader problem of neoliberalization of higher education also contributes and exacerbates this process. We all know about the hegemony of market imperative worldwide and also in academia, and this also affects the process of knowledge production and labor relations in academia. In the case of Indonesian state universities, for example, a number of research and studies, including this one by Inaya Rahmani, a good colleague of mine, shows that the neoliberal market reform actually reproduce academic insularities and bureaucratization of research process instead of promoting a more competitive and supposedly productive and high quality research environment. So in a way, academics end up joining this rat race in academia and also the broader economy. And as a result, tons of scholars become what we can call as cognitariat, basically precarious, semi-proletariat teachers and researchers with precarious employment status and with lack of job security, but a limited stratum of these scholars benefits actually from this process, using the critical sociologist Eric Olin Wright's typology. Some of these academics actually occupy contradictory class locations as what we can call as professional managerial class. Right. So if you think about the classic bourgeois versus proletariat class struggle, some of these elite workers, so to speak, occupy these contradictory class locations. Let's say somewhere between semi-autonomous wage earners and managers. And what is professional manager class? To be more exact here, I borrowed the definition from Catherine Liu, a humanities scholar. It is basically a stratum of elite workers working in the white-collar sector, in this case academia, who quote-unquote labor in a world of performative identity and virtue signaling. So it is quite similar to the notion of labor aristocracy, in that this is a layer of elite workers, and their status and characteristics are quite different compared to those academics or scholars or researchers who have to toil themselves to support their livelihood. And I would say that I have to say that as much as though I see myself as someone who is sympathetic to the struggle of social movements in Indonesia, I actually might be can described as part of this labor aristocracy, labor aristocracy as well. I discussed part of this in an article of mine published back in 2021. Obviously, as scholars, as cognitive workers, so to speak, each one of us, we all have our struggle in the workplace. We all have our domestic responsibilities. In my case, as a breadwinner, and I have multiple tasks and responsibilities to handle as well. In my involvement with agrarian social movement and other types of social movements in Indonesia. But I also have to admit that within these activities, in my career trajectory so far, I have also accumulated, what the popular discourses call as privileges, or I would say, to be more exact, a form of surplus values. Not necessarily in a form of exploitation of my fellow academic workers, but in a sense, I benefit from this process because through my research activities, I'm able to accumulate some benefits that my other colleagues, especially for those who are based in many of those who are based in Indonesia, for example, might not be able to enjoy what I've been enjoying so far in terms of my privileges. So, for example, in terms of my employment status, my employment status so far have been mostly temporary. I work. I have multiple academic appointments, and sometimes income from one job or one gig subsidizes my research activities for another gig, for example. But compared to the average condition of Indonesian lecturers and scholars, for example, I would say that I enjoy a higher wage compared to my colleagues working at domestic institutions. For example, I also enjoy the experience of networking with fellow colleagues and also networking with various interlocutors on the field. And this experience, in a way, is valued as an expertise by institutions in Indonesia and elsewhere, and this expertise is attached to me as a researcher. So in a way, I benefit from this process as well, and I gain reputation as as a researcher, as an expert on this topic, and get invited to forums like this, for example, or I'm able to join forums like this, whereas many other colleagues, for example, or many other interlocutors in the field might not be able to enjoy the kind of experience that I'm having right now. So to give you a concrete example here, the fact that I'm able to join and insert myself in the circuit of academic conferences and also in the circuit of social movement meetings, for example, in multiple places in global knowledge institutions, as well as in multiple meetings with community members on the ground, shows how, through my research activity and community engagement activities so far, I've been able to accumulate surplus values and resources, and therefore be seen as someone who has the expertise to speak on something. And I think this is something that we have to acknowledge as a social movement researcher. I think my experience is, I think there are other examples of scholars and civil society elites, to use Johansson and Ufflin's terminology. There are other scholars and civil society elites who have the same labor aristocracy status as I do in Indonesian academia and social movements, and these accumulated surpluses take forms in multiple ways. They enjoy reputations as credible social movement scholars or activists. They enjoy, in some cases, they get financial compensation for the work that they are doing in their research and activist works. They're able to enjoy multiple employment gigs in multiple forms, from commission studies to consultancies, for example. They're able to increase their standing within the social movement research industrial complex, if I may use that term. And in some cases, they're able to have broader, they're able to have some sort of political influence, for example, in the broader political arena, getting invited as advisors to ministries or government agencies, for example. So this is a common phenomenon, and perhaps more so than we would like to acknowledge, and this is something that we have to think about and reflect upon very deeply, I would say. But things are not always gloomy. I think there are possible alternatives. There are possible ways out of this conundrum or problem. And these are just based on my reflections as a scholar activist researching about social movements in Indonesia. There are a couple of steps that we can take, and this will be the last point of my presentation. First is perhaps we should consider researching topics other than progressive social movements. Perhaps we can consider researching topics of quote-unquote our enemies, of the elites, for example, and use those insights from that research to help social movement building and organizing. Applied research for formulating strategies and policies of social movements done in collaboration with social movement actors is also another alternative that we can pursue. We should also start to think about democratic control of the intellectuals by social movements themselves, and put ourselves in a more or less equal positions and maintain good and personal working relations with social movement actors, folks that we're working with in communities on the ground. And lastly, let's try our best to get involved in the day-to-day work of social movement organizing, which might be difficult given our responsibilities on campus and our domestic responsibilities, but I think it is not impossible. I think there are ways to strategize about that, and there are ways to get involved in the day-to-day work of social movement organizing while taking out responsibilities. And of course, we should also keep in mind to explore the possibility of conducting cognitive work or research outside of academia, conducting research in collaboration with communities and other interlocutors, other entities outside of the ivory tower of universities and campuses. And that would be the end of my reflection. And that is all. And I'm happy to hear your thoughts, suggestions, and questions on this matter. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a super interesting presentation. Well, and I see that you get some digital applause here in the audience. And I think that then we move on. And we have a second presenter, Paul-François Tremblay. You come from the Department of Religious Studies, School of Social Science and Global Studies at the Open University in UK. And the presentation is named Transitional Activism and the Making and Unmaking of Moral Publics. And by this presentation, I will leave the word to you.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, the paper is called Transnational Activism and the Making and Unmaking of a Moral Public. What I'm interested in is composition. By composition, I'm going to be talking about processes through which a panoply of forces, in this case forces of affection or affect, were emerging from expressions of grief and mourning and how they might lead to the formation of a moral public. In 2019, IBON International and the Campaign for Human Rights in the Philippines made preparations for relatives of the victims of former President Duterte's war on drugs to travel to meet members of the European Parliament, as well as diasporic and other publics in Europe and the UK. At the same time, the play Talbot is only one there, a dramatic monologue exploring different perspectives of those involved in the drugs war, including those of victims and perpetrators, was touring Europe. And these activities were accompanied by posts on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, among other platforms. So what I'm talking about, what I'm focusing on is affect and mourning as a sort of Filipino idiom for speaking to power, but also as an effective force for the making of a moral public assembled transnationally across borders to bring political pressure to bear on the Duterte regime. So the objective is to theorize the role of affect in the making and unmaking of a moral public in the context of a neoliberal modernity said to be corrosive of moral action. And following Zizi Papakarisi's reference to theories of ritual in her work on affective publics, I'm going to try and draw on Emile Durkheim's compositional theory of ritual effervescence and the origin of religion to make my case. So start with a few, define a few terms. I'm using the term transnational to denote relatively informal exchanges of ideas, information, materials, and practices between groups and individuals across national and regional borders. Groups like CHRP UK and IBON International do not operate in a vacuum, but as part of networks. These networks are not like sewage or railway systems with fixed lines connecting concrete points in space. Rather, these networks are constantly mutating as new groups emerge and others disappear. The lines connecting them fade as communication slows and emerge again if and when exchanges recommence. My focus on CHRP UK and IBON indeed simplifies a complex global ecosystem behind the campaign against the war on drugs, which also included a range of Filipino and international partners, including Karapatan and the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, ICHRP. Yet transnational does not only refer to the networked exchanges of these groups, which have been further enabled, of course, by digital media. It also refers to a range of other informal exchanges among Filipino diasporic networks, which have a strong presence in Europe. Now, the second term, moral publics, been used before, notably by Alessandro Jedlowski. Jedlowski draws from Warner's work on publics, and in particular Warner's claim that a public is a self-organizing entity that exists by virtue of being addressed, in this case by some moral or ethical dilemma in society, such that it is called upon to decide who is responsible for what happened. So given that, a transnational moral public is a public grounded not in ties of kinship or belonging to a nation state or any sovereign territory. Rather, it's an affection or solidarity and its moral standpoint, with a moral standpoint, and it comes from elsewhere. And I'm going to suggest that it's fabricated by forces of affect. So I did the research for this project. This is me some years ago when I'm doing actual physical ethnographic work. So this research was conducted during lockdown in the UK at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was in touch with CHRP UK. To be clear, I'm actually a member of CHRP UK and IBON International, and I conducted online interviews with activists, attended meetings and events remotely, explored their respective websites where they curate their activities, and did a bit of social media searching on hashtags. CHRP UK was launched in London in 2006 in response to a spike in extrajudicial killings during the technocratic presidency of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. Amnesty International have released a highly critical report on the human rights situation in the archipelago, and the group was established by volunteers to try to apply pressure on the Filipino government to stop the killings, firstly by raising awareness in the UK about the human rights situation in the Philippines, and secondly by highlighting British trade and investments implicated in human rights violations across the islands. IBON International is a much larger organisation with salaried staff and offices in Europe and Africa, as well as in Manila. The IBON Foundation was founded in 1978 and was part of the resistance to the Marcos dictatorship. IBON International was conceived in 2005, and through its international offices, it works with social movements and civil society organisations to support and enhance democratic participation in human development. My main point is that both of these organisations are in the business of making publics, by which I mean that through organising events, disseminating knowledge and best practice, and by generating publicity around specific issues, they seek to create sites and occasions around which publics can coalesce and mobilise to try to secure particular social, developmental and political objectives. So now onto the war on drugs itself. Efforts to hold the Duterte administration to account for the numerous reports of human rights abuses linked to the so-called war on drugs began in earnest with the indictment of Duterte by the International People's Tribunal, Brussels, in September 2018, in which IBON International worked alongside the International Campaign for Human Rights in the Philippines, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the European Association of Lawyers for Democracy and World Human Rights, and the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. But then in 2019, IBON brought relatives of victims of the war on drugs to meet members of the European Parliament, members of the European External Action Service, and parliamentarians from Belgium and other places, while the Playtale Pot toured Europe. Additionally, CHRP UK, in collaboration with the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of the University of London, brought the play to London and arranged for a mother of one of the victims to speak to the audience afterwards. For both IBON and CHRP UK, this was an opportunity to engage with the Filipino diaspora and wider publics, to build support for the campaign and amplify opposition to the Duterte administration and the war on drugs in the Philippines, in Europe and globally. As one IBON activist explained to me, that was a very emotional time, actually. I came here, the relatives, and met with the parliamentarians. It's like really being confronted with, you see, I'm going to cry. You know it's happening, but when you hear them, you hear their testimonies, it's like it brings a whole different dimension. It's not just me, I think, it's the people we met, the parliamentarians that we met, the officials that we met. It was a different dimension than just hearing about it in the news or watching on the internet, for example. It was also a European-wide activity. They went to the UK, they went to Iceland, they went to Germany, they went to Italy, and they came to Belgium and the Netherlands. Aside from it being an occasion for the various diasporas to gather, to receive them and even watch the Playtale Pot, because there was an accompanying play with that. I think that leg, that tour produced, I can be wrong after that, probably also a lot of work for other organisations. After that, the European External Action Service came up with a report. And of course, later on, the European Parliament came up also with a resolution on the Philippines expressing concern about the human rights situation. course, there's no guarantee it's a direct correlation. So on September 17th, 2020, the European Parliament indeed passed a resolution expressing concern, serious concern about ongoing human rights violations in the Philippines and the war on drugs. A political objective, namely gaining the support of international partners to apply political and diplomatic pressure to the Duterte regime's self-styled war on drugs, was secured, although, as the activist quoted above indicates, it's not possible to draw a strict cause and effect relationship between the campaign and the resolution. My interest lies with the way the campaign and its different elements generated a moral public. Of course, there was the careful process of working with EU parliamentarians and diplomats, of working with the mechanisms and protocols of the EU Parliament to provide empirical evidence of human rights abuses that could in turn provide a clear rationale for a resolution. At the same time, the mode of address included embodied performances of grief designed to generate affection between audiences and performers, which was precisely intended to hail a transnational public into being. According to Michael Warner, publics are conventionally imagined according to an ideology of language that privileges critical readers and rational scrutineers. At one level, the campaign against the war on drugs was presented in these terms. Evidence about human rights abuses was documented for informed scrutiny and for rational judgment by European parliamentarians, diplomats, and diasporic and European publics, among others. But at another level, the campaign called upon parliamentarians and others to be embodied witnesses to violent deaths and bereavement. For Warner, publics that do not subscribe to the ideology of language are counter-publics. But perhaps a better description would be, following the work of Zizi Papakarisi, affective publics, given the centrality of mourning and affect to the mode of address. So affect has a kind of Filipino cultural resonance. Filipino scholars, including Ileto and Rafael, as well as anthropologists such as Cannell, have written about dame, which concerns identification with and sympathy for suffering. Of course, sympathy is not just a Filipino idiom, as Papakarisi's powerful personal anecdote about the student uprisings in Greece in November 1973 made clear. And indeed, Papakarisi, reflecting on the events in 1973, but also on a research about the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, looks at the difference between the adhesive qualities of affect against Max Weber's conception of rational self-interest as the cement of modernity. She also notes some of the classical theories of ritual and culture developed by the likes of Mary Douglas, Arnold van Gennep, and Victor Turner to suggest that the power of affect lies, and I'm quoting, and it's on the slide, lies in liminality, in pre-emergence and emergence, or at the point at which new formations of the political are in the process of being imagined but not yet articulated. The form of affective power is pre-actualized, networked, and of a liquid nature. Papakarisi's language of liquids and emergence then points to the compositional affordances of effect, while a nod to theories of ritual suggested a field of sociological and anthropological theory too often overlooked in discussion about politics and publics. I've lost my way in terms of how much time I have, but I'll just carry on until you ask me to stop, if that's okay. I've got to,
I think that you have another 3-5 minutes to go.
Okay, actually that sounds okay. That's where I thought I might be.
Notes.
Okay, so so here we are with theories of ritual, the idea of liminality and the idea of affects. So one of the ideas in theories of ritual and liminality is that liminality is a sort of anti-structure or a non-structure. Brian Masumi, by contrast, has talked about affect as in the same kind of vein. It offers what he calls a sort of fluidity. He talks about the compositional affordances of affect as, quote, an active pressure again towards taking form and as the ongoing force of the social taking form. Of course, there are reasons to be nervous or anxious about affect. For example, we've seen in various populist movements around the world the way emotions, particularly emotions of fear and hatred, can be amplified and the way particular kinds of politics solicit, capture, and generate particular effects. Nevertheless, if we look at the example that that I've laid out. I think what we have is CHRP UK and IBON International, among other partners, working across various platforms, creating a public in which affect is playing a key role. What are the kinds of things that we could learn from Durkheim's theory of religion and ritual? One of the key things, I think, is the way that when people come together as a public, they feel in Durkheim's theory that some kind of moral force is exerted upon them to carry out certain actions. A second thing that we can learn from Durkheim's theory of ritual is through that they have the capacity not just to feel themselves as belonging to a moral community, but to act as members of a moral community. A third thing we can learn from Durkheim's theory of ritual is the sort of double morphology of the ritual moment, and that is, ritual isn't just about coming together, about composition, it's also about, as it were, the ebb of ritual. It's also about decomposition. In short, the moral public against the war on drugs forms through these various through this campaign taking place across borders. It forms, it gets the resolution passed, and then it ebbs and seeps away and becomes, and probably the people who are part of it are then just becoming part of other campaigns. So what I've tried to do in this paper, and I apologize for the slightly rushed and perhaps unfinished nature of the paper, what I've tried to do is detail how two organisations, IBON International and CHRP UK, work together to bring relatives of the victims of former President Duterte's war on drugs to meet members of the European Parliament and diasporic publics while the Playtale bot toured Europe. The events were amplified on social media, and the events required embodied witness to expressions of grief and mourning. And what I've tried to suggest, following Papa Carisi's interest in emergence, liminality and theories of ritual, and following an engagement with Durkheim's theory of ritual, is we can use these theories to try and understand how something like affect can help generate a moral public that allows us to take a moral position and engage in moral action in the context of neoliberal modernity. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for a very interesting presentation and for bringing the concept of affect to this panel. Well, and so we move on to our third presenter, Ali Minantu, right? And he's a PhD student at the Department of Media Studies, Charles University in Czech Republic. And you're also a lecturer at the Department of Communication, Islamic University of Indonesia. Is that correct? A correct presentation?
Yeah.
And well, welcome to the panel, and you can go.
Okay. Thank you very much. Dobry den. I'm greeting from Prague. Yes, I'm Ali Minanto. Originally, I'm from Yogyakarta, but now I live in Prague for doing my study in Charles University. And thank you very much for having me in this beautiful forum. And let me to share my presentation. Oh, sorry. Could you see my slide? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to share my preliminary findings research I want to talk about street art as creative social movement, the practice of street art in Jakarta in the post-Suharto. It is part of my dissertation project actually, and so it is ongoing process, and maybe in the end of November or next month, I want to go back to my hometown, to Jakarta, and doing my field research. So today, maybe it's just a preliminary finding. That's why I need your suggestions to improve my research. Oh, okay. Okay. Before I start my presentation about street art in Indonesia, let me to make disclaimer about street art, because sometimes it is very controversial or sometimes debatable about the definition of street art. That's why I want to make the common perception about street art, because it is very sometimes complex, has complex definition. But I have keywords of street art. The first is street, of course, and then public, alternative, participatory art. And the concept of street itself, sometimes it has a various definition. Like Alexiou, for example, a street is defined as the game or the true reality or the life outside the rules, for example, or the battlefield. Or from Eric Prasetya, he is the street photographer in Indonesia. He defines street as freedom, tension, public sphere, conflict, and so on. From that definition, I try to conclude about the street artists, because historically, street art used the spirit of resistance against the established structure or established power by using public surface like wall or the other medium, including public transport as medium of expression. If we look at the history in 70s. And okay, there are many assumptions of street art, but I try to put in the similar, or I want to juxtapose street art with urban art, public art, or post-graffiti, because sometimes between graffiti and mural or street art, sometimes it's still debatable. Okay, and now I think street arts not only occur in the real life, but also in the metaverse, in the virtual life. We can see the street art. Okay, back to my background about street art in Indonesia. This is why I'm interested to conduct research about street art in Indonesia, because I think street art cannot be neglected in Indonesian political history. It has emerged in the Indonesian historical phase, ranging from the colonial period into the Reformation era. It means in the post-Suharto. You can see it is like graffiti in the in the pre-independence in the post 45 when Indonesia re-colonized. Okay, and this is it is very popular. Bung Ayo Bung. It is in Bahasa Indonesia, maybe bro, come on bro. It was created by Avandi, the very prominent artist in Indonesia. Okay, and so back to the new order, the resignation of Suharto became a crucial moment for democratization in Indonesia after 32 years under the authoritarianism era. And therefore, Indonesia in the post-Suharto is the portrait of a new democracy where public voices are celebrated through various media, including street art. And nowadays, 24 years after Reformasi, street art has a significant role in conveying public voices regarding several actual issues, especially in urban space. Street art has transformed from merely visual activity into a creative social movement. Okay, my locus of research in Yogyakarta, it is Indonesian archipelago, and this is Yogyakarta. Okay. And why Yogyakarta is important in my research, because Yogyakarta has many labels. The first is Yogyakarta is special region. Yogyakarta is ruled by a monarchy system with pre-independent style sultanate, according to the Geusa, and then Yogyakarta become Yogyakarta is the ex capital of the Republic of Indonesia when the Dutch took over Jakarta in 1946 until 49. And Yogyakarta has many labels. So Jakarta is labeled as a city of culture, education, art, city of tourism, and since 1950 until 1960s, Jakarta is inhabited by artists in various genres. And since 2000, it has been ordained as the city of street art or city of mural, marked by numerous street art projects organized massively as a beautification and aesthetic movement. And Jakarta has many street artists and street art collectives dispersed sporadically in the city. Okay, okay, this is Yogyakarta, but beside the many labels of Jakarta, Jakarta also has several issues like the construction of hotels, housing area in productive line, hypermarket, and so on. And it will be like the object of resistance by state artists. And this objective of the research is want to investigate the practice of street art in Jakarta in the post-authoritarian era as creative social movement. And because street art using the city as its gallery, so it's considered an alternative media for articulating public voices, which is different from mainstream media. Hence, street art is also ordained as public art, where the public can participate in making process as a subject of art, not only just audience. Bailey contends that alternative media will produce alternative communication in everyday life, and it will lead to social movement. And I will employ several scholars' notions, such as from, okay, it is very obstacle for me to pronounce French. Yeah, the first is from Michel de Sarto. I hope I'm not wrong to mention it. And then Henri Leveb, and then Nicolas Bourdieu, I think, and then Michel de Sarto. Okay, the first is about the concept of the practice of everyday life, introduced by Michel de Sarto. Sarto said that in the practice of everyday life, there is an essential critical distinction between strategies and tactic of this battle of repression and expression. Sarto contends that tactic and struggle are operated through everyday practice. Tactics indicate resistance without a tendency to be oppositional. Everyday life is not just an investigation of social activities, but also puts everyday practices as the principal analysis that deals with the poetic of everyday life. And then it is very popular scholar talking about the spatial production. Leveb in the production of space in 1974, he provided a new perspective of the study of space, which was not always related to mathematics and geometry, but related to the social aspect. And Leveb introduced the triadic of space. I will operate this concept to see the practice of street art. And then Nicolas Bourdieu shows that contemporary art practice is never excluded from the social context. The relational aesthetic emphasizes participatory artwork created collaboratively with the public to respond to public life issues. And relational aesthetic requires the presence of the public, not as a crowd of spectators, but as a subject actively involved in the creating works. Okay, and then some concept of social movement from Sidney Taro, and then the concept of creative activism. I will use the qualitative research method, and then using document, observation, in-depth interview. So far, I have identified 45 street artists in Jakarta. Maybe the number will, I will add the number. And so far I met a key informant, like Samuel Indratma. It is a very prominent figure for street art in Indonesia, and Anagart. But the trail of street art in Yogyakarta can be identified, can be found in 1980s in Kampung Chode or Chode riverbank village in Yogyakarta. It is in the center of Yogyakarta. I want to introduce you Romo Mangunwijaya. He was a pastor or Catholic priest, but he was also an architect, activist, novelist, and he redesigned, reconstructed, recombined the architectural design and mural so that the new design has two meanings. The first is beautification, and the second one is the protest, because he transforms Kampung Chode from the slum area into the attractive settlement and become a tourist destination, I think until now. So the new design prevented eviction plans being carried out by the local government, the city government at that time in 1980s. And its location now in the city center makes Kampung Kalijodo as the point of interest for the pedestrian crossing the new town, Kota Baru, especially from the Gondolayu Bridge. Okay, I have no picture about it, but okay. This is Samuel Indratma, someone who I introduced you. He is the founder of Apotecomic. Apotecomic, I think, is the first of street art collective after Suharto. Maybe it is not need to be correct. But
I just want to say that you have a few minutes to go now.
Okay.
Soon to end the presentation.
Okay, I just want to show rapidly. Okay, 1997, it is started with mural Melayang, repeating mural, and then 1999 and 20 and 28. But I want to, the kind of spirit is how Samuel want to transform from the high art into the low art. So it is the project of Samuel Indratma with Apotecomic. The first is levitating mural as it continues like this. It is the landscape of Yogyakarta at the time. And then, okay, I just want to show you some street art pieces. And maybe it is very interesting. One of the project of Apotecomic, it's called the project of Bonsowong, or the Dark Village. The Dark Village is not just the nickname for the village with a dark story, but it is literally dark because very like lightless. And there is a story when we talk about the Indonesian history in 1980s, there is the phenomena of Petrus or penembak misterius or mysterious shooter that occurs from 1983 until 1985. And Petrus was illegal murder of criminal committed by state at a time to reduce the number of crimes. And okay, this method is quote unquote effective because more than 70% state can decrease the number of crime, but it is very controversial actually. Okay, and then this is the other project like resist of visual trace. So it is like critic to at the advertisement product or the political campaign using baliho or the other campaign medium. And this is 2010, I think, become one of very crucial moment in street art in Yogyakarta, because there is gravity that criticizes the local government regarding to the gentrification in Yogyakarta. Okay, and it is the collaboration between street artists and NGO activists and people. They initiated warga berdaya or empowered people. They try to resist the gentrification issue in Yogyakarta, and one of the campaign is Jogja Asat campaign. It is like the dry water campaign because the construction of hotels, hypermarket, and so forth influence the quality and the capacity of water in Yogyakarta. And I want to show you some street art pieces by Anti Tang, and then okay, it is like a critic to the local government regarding the gentrification. And Okay, that is one thing of the project of state art in Yogyakarta is not only in urban area, but also in the rural area. One of the project is in Genang village, initiated by Ruang Kelas SD or elementary school classroom collectives. It is the picture. So it is like, what's that? A trigger new habit for the inhabitant, for the residents of the villagers to appreciate the street art pieces in their village or in their kampung. Okay, like this. So they try to reflect a lot of social issues in this area. And in 2017, street art tried to resist or protest against the politics of identity, especially when there is the impact of the politics in Indonesia when people are divided into the two extreme polarization. And this is the artist, one of my key informants. Okay, and it is interesting because there is the transformation from street art with the previous or the old medium into the animation. And it is created by Samuel Indratma. It is made collaboration between artists and pesantren student or Islamic boarding school student to to protect and to present local content or local knowledge, especially the teaching that refer to a yellow book or kitab kuning in the pesantren. Okay, and this is 2020 to respond the problem during the pandemic relating to the policy about vaccination, about everything. Okay, and this is.
Do you think that you can round up a bit?
Yes, it is the last. Okay, in 2021, I had a project collaboration with the artists, and I made like documentary to respond to the environmental issue, and this is the project, and it is like a documentary to regarding to the environmental issue that respond by street artists in Indonesia, and this is some social movement, I think, triggered by several street art pieces in Indonesia, and this is okay. It's one of the social media to trigger people to ask people to join this movement. Okay, this is my initial findings. The first is street art as a creative social movement in Yogyakarta, because we can identify from the alternative actor, and then the public issues, the collective movement goals and strategy, and street art is considered as alternative media. Street art is also ordained as public art, where the public can participate in the making process. Street art is medium of protest. Street art is spatial production. And then street art is collaborative action. Street art is medium of public literacy to make public awareness. And the street art is used to protect and cultivate the local knowledge. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you. So I think that's all.
And thank you so much for showing us all these creative images.
Thank you.
Just very, very inspiring. Okay, so let's move on. We are running out of time, but we have our last presenter today, and Susan Pamtin, and you are from Political Science Department, Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, and I'm leaving the word to you, and welcome.
Thank you very much to all of you and the previous speakers. Yes, my name is Susanne Pham, that's the short version. I graduated from Humboldt University in Germany in area studies, focused on Vietnam there, then graduated from sociology with my PhD from University of Manchester, and now I am working at Bilkent University in Ankara because it's a nice place to understand the synthesis of Western and non-Western ideas, and that is one of my fields, or try to make it one of my fields, with which I would like to enter today's talk as well. So I focus today on political Catholics, dissident Catholics in Vietnam. So for that, I went to Vietnam, of course, to do my fieldwork in 2018 and 19. I was trying to learn in a very broad sense who dissidents are, in general terms, what they do, why they do it, why they risk their lives, why they risk their physical and mental freedom to make a case, for what they wanted to do that. So that question of who these dissidents are became more pressing, especially after 2 cases in Vietnam. In 2016-17, some of you might recall it, there was a marine disaster in central Vietnam, which affected the whole country. A Taiwanese steel factory was throwing their wastewater into the sea, which affected tons of, or caused tons of dead fish to be washed ashore. And of course, that area was becoming very politically active, and the whole country was politically active in response to that as well. And the second event that became so crucial in terms of who dissidents are were the nationwide protest against special economic zones and the Chinese dominance over certain industries and investments in Vietnam. 2018 that was. So during that time, different fronts, political fronts, state fronts, public fronts as well, suspected that so-called hostile forces, so-called dissidents, so-called anti-communist forces were behind these protests. Especially for the latter case, for the protest against special economic zones, that there's not really evidence to be found there. But while on field work, also trying to understand who these dissidents are, what they do, what they want, I came across a significant number of Catholics who were involved in different subgroups, for example, democracy movements, human rights movements, few labor activists who were explicitly Catholic as well, and many activists from the environmental movements were outspoken in their Catholicism as well. And that first case that I mentioned, the movement against that Taiwanese company, a Taiwanese factory, Formosa, they were mainly led by Catholic priests and laymen. So the question that was pressing was, why Catholics seem to be, seem to become an aspect or a factor that needs attention, and why those Christians are kind of open to a particular kind of politics, given the absence of institutionalized opposition against the ruling Communist Party in Vietnam, given the absence of other, representative institutions that would allow them to have a channel to articulate. So to quote a Marxist scholar that inspired me in a sense while I was going through that process of understanding what's going on, is the following. David McLennan said, "It matters what kind of Marxism or socialism is adopted by those who are inclined to espouse such ideas. So it would be a mistake for those on the left to fail to leave some space for religion in their approach to society and politics." So I hope, without any further explanation, me showing that quote indicates my kind of positionality with regard to that topic. Yeah. So many people who, remember Vietnam or associate something with Vietnam, especially in the West, would have the view of Vietnam as being, communist, post-socialist, maybe with a revolutionary history, let's say that, to say the least. But the image of Vietnam has changed, of course, in the last decades towards, some sort of full-fledged market capitalism, high levels of corruption. Recent work by my colleague Adam Ford has shown that, or estimates an approximate of 1/4 of the country's GDP is based on corruption. The generations of, these revolutionary leaders that led Vietnam into liberation and into reunification against French colonialism, against Western American imperialism, these generations that were, emotionally committed, they were emotionally connected, passed away, are too old now, or very old, and not holding the major force within the party. So what happens recently is that we see more and more ideological fights within the party apparatus, because the younger generation of leaders of the party are kind of too young to be emotionally connected to the independence movement, which is Levitsky's observation. So what I observed is that it seems that dissident Catholics, or let's say Christians in that term, political Christians, seem to fill a gap that the Communist Party and other religious groups are incapable of doing, so incapable of filling. This is in one way for me not surprising, but in another way it's quite confusing, since as a trained sociologist, as someone coming from Marxist decolonial tradition as well, Catholicism is actually quite compatible with, let's say, the destructive forces of capitalism, and of course associated with the legacy of the Western Christian civilizing mission and French colonialism. So the question is where Catholic resistance fits into that. And as someone who's sympathetic to activists and to the left and to the Marxist side, the question is also, that ties or links to that today's panel, who should we be ethical to? Who should we be responsible to? As a scholar activist, or only as a scholar? Is it the repressed Vietnamese Catholics that we should side with? Is it maybe the secular Vietnamese who criticize the Catholic Church, church's conservatism, the patriarchy, global alliance with the rich and the powerful? Or is it maybe in a very abstract and scholarly sense, should we be ethical towards the project of decolonization, like resisting the idea of Western epistemology, Western religion and Western capitalist ideology to be reproduced in the non-Western societies? So the question also is, do I need to unlearn, do I need to defamiliarize myself with dominant narratives about Catholicism? Two things that I learned throughout this process, and I would like to share this before I go into detail. Two things I learned. One is that throughout the period of anti-colonial, anti-imperial resistance in Vietnam, that relationship between the Catholics and the communist forces was defined by complicated structures and fractures and divisions. So it's not a clear antagonism, it's not a clear relationship between these two subjects, let's say. And the second point that I learned is that this complicated and fractured relationship between Catholics and communists persists until today. So now this actually requires a, let's say, 3 minutes history crash course to understand why all this is important now, and how all this makeup of the forces, of the different, contradicting, fractured forces, got us to where we are today. So Catholics in Vietnam have, of course, always been a minority. But if I'm very blunt here and bit crude towards historians, I would make the categorization of the Catholic Church prior to 75 and the Catholic Church post 75. 75, of course, the end of the American War and the beginning of the reunification of North and South Vietnam. So prior to 75, we can say the Catholic...
Would it be possible for you to wrap up within 3 minutes? We are running out of time, and I would like to have some questions also from the audience.
Okay. I'm on 8 minutes now, so I still have the 7 minutes left.
According to my list, you have to 45, but if you need a few more minutes, and maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, I was just doing my thing, the alarm. Okay, so there are two different strands. One prior to 75 was considered as anti-colonial, reactionary, and the dominant strand after 75 could be seen as more conciliatory, self-limiting, and non-political. While these two dominant strands existed, there were, however, two minority strands within the Catholic sphere that promoted some sort of a counter-hegemonic position towards the dominant position of the Catholic Church and against, the alliance with the powerful and the wealthy. So I skipped that historical crash course then and jump to present-day Catholic dissidents. Okay, so you will see in that picture, and I will show you more pictures in the next few minutes. In contrast to the previous dominant strands and the minority strands of Catholic dissidents that try to counter that anti-communist and anti-colonial strand of the Catholic Church. Present-day Catholic Church is, as I said, quite integrated, quite co-opted by the state, but there's a minority group of dissident Catholics that emerged and supported social movements that publicly questioned the political legitimacy of today's Communist Party. And in a way, not just question the Communist Party, but question authoritarianism and question the idea of, or indirectly question the capitalist Communist Party's capital practice. So today, dissident activists seem to fill a certain void that has been left by communist and by former French, Canadian missionaries, it seems. What void they seem to fill can be seen when we look at the areas where Catholic dissidents are strong, which is in central Vietnam, the poorest communities, of course. So it seems that many dissident Catholics are filling the void in the way of providing social institutions to locals who are in material need. Yeah, so this is a picture of the Catholic community in central Vietnam, in Nghệ An, protesting in front of the wall of the Formosa factory. You see nationwide protests in the country. And a very interesting priest that I managed to visit, I managed to interview, had very interesting conversations, but to give you one interesting quote, he said, according to the authorities' language, our government is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But nothing of this is close to reality. Rather, it would be better to say Vietnam of Formosa, by Formosa, and for Formosa only. So although he's a Catholic, although he says that he's anti-communist, his critique is inherently anti-capitalist, and a critique against the mismanagement of the VCP towards, capitalist institutions, capitalist factories. Other pictures of Catholics protesting against the special economic zones. And I would like to show you finally some pictures from the parish of that priest Dang Hu Nam in central Vietnam. So his parish is full of political banners that say no to economic zones, no to Chinese investments, no to the cybersecurity law in Vietnam, freedom for political prisoners. So he's very active there. He's inspired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He's inspired by Martin Luther King, who say, of course, if when we are silent, we are actually siding with the oppressors. If we choose to accept injustice, we are actually, doing a mistake. He also cited Vietnamese bishop, who said, no one in this country was speaking up when our country is so polluted. We have an incredible environmental pollution problem in Vietnam. And don't ask me why, but there was also a banner of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was cited with, this world is engulfed in suffering, not because of the crimes of the bad guys, but because of the silence of the good people. So for priest Dang Hu Nam, it's actually, being political itself is for him being universally political is a Christian duty. That's what he kept saying. And another priest said, that socialist ideal, that kind of communism that is practiced today is something that was an idea for them that, of course, aligns with different values of Catholicism, aligns with trends of liberation theology that we find in South America. But the way that socialism is empirically enacted, like the real existing socialism that we observe today, that is what they criticize. So as a last point, two questions that remain open for me during that process is, again, ethical towards whom? Ethical towards the Catholics? Should I be ethical towards the Catholic dissidents? Should I be ethical towards the secular Vietnamese who are against, that ideological indoctrination? Or should we be ethical towards the idea of, or the project of decolonization? And in terms of theory, questions remain open as well. Is there an emerging form of liberation theology in Vietnam that is critical, not just or indirectly critical of capitalism, but is critical of the lived authoritarianism of existing communist parties? And if so, can we theorize Vietnam's Catholic liberation theology as something that continuously adapts to the changing unequal state-society relations that we see throughout the history of Vietnam, from anti-colonial resistance to anti-communist resistance to anti-authoritarian, anti-VCP resistance. Okay, I hope I managed to keep in time. That's it from me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for your presentation. We have 10 minutes to go, and I think that I will ask some short questions. I will keep myself short as we don't have so much time. I will encourage people to ask questions in the chat, and I will read them up after I have asked myself a few questions. Well, in regard to the last presentations, I wonder if you have some reflections upon your own questions, ethical towards whom? I think that was really an interesting take. And how would you formulate an answer to those interesting questions? I can just move on, and in regard to ICRA's presentation, you talk about different hierarchies and gaps between those who study and yourself, but also hierarchies within the academia. And I wonder if you have an answer to the question, how could you as a scholar resist the situation within academia to create a fairer situation for us who are part of that sphere? In regard to Paul Francis' presentation, I think that was really inspiring, and I really like the concept of moral public. I was thinking about Rose's concept of ethopolitics. I don't know if you have come in contact with that. And he talks a lot about how it's possible to govern populations in the nexus between the collective and the individuals. Self-government of individuals that are encouraged by a kind of a moral governing. Do you think that concept of ethopolitics could contribute to your research? And then we have Ali's presentation. I think it's super interesting with the street art, and I also enjoyed very much your images that you presented. You said in your presentation that you can see that the street art somehow triggers a creative social movement. And I know that James Scott, he also talks about how, individual resistance, small acts of resistance could move into something larger, to larger movements, even political parties. I wonder, could you see the opposite trend, that movements create individual expressions of resistance and dissent? So could you take it the other way around? Yes, I assume that are my questions. But before moving on, I think that I will read some questions from the chat, and then you can all reflect upon some overall questions. We have a question here. Let's see. What surplus value do social movements extract from academics? Is the surfaces of the city that enable street art? That could be a question. And here's another question. Are you yourself an artist? Minantu, that is a question that Gabriel asked. Let's see. Here's another question for Susanne. Are there any parallels between Vietnamese Catholic descents and Catholic descents in Poland? In the Vietnamese case, do the Catholic descents try to formulate a non-party state conceptualization of socialism or populism? And are there any attempts by anti-state leftists in Vietnam to approach the Catholic descents? Okay, so now you have a handful of questions, and I think that we have 7 minutes to answer these. So you have only 1 to 2 minutes per person, but I think that let's just go around, and you can all reflect upon all these different questions. And of course, you can also answer things in the chat. Okay, so shall we start with ICRA, as we did with the presentation?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'll be brief. Yeah, and we can discuss later after this session for sure. I think there are possible ways for organizing resistance within academia itself, and of course, different scholars have different inclinations and decisions. I myself tend to prioritize struggles outside of academia, but I know, for example, colleagues such as Herlambang, who did his presentation earlier, who is involved in organizing academics and researchers for academic freedom in Indonesia. For example, in my own activities, I try to basically pursue a more collaborative engagement in terms of research and the logistics of research. So making sure that the research process itself is as collaborative and as ethical as we can be. So those are the practical solutions, I guess. But I think the broader question, the broader philosophical question is, we need to think about ways to basically reorganize our research activities and the way universities are administered, for example, the way our research activities are administered and managed, for example. So I think those are the questions that we need to ask and ponder upon if we want to organize resistance from within academia. So that's the first question. The second question is whether social movements also, accrue or accumulate some surplus values from academics. I think some social movement elites or leaders, for example, I think they do also benefit from this process in that they gain recognition and standing as the legitimate representatives of their communities. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so we move on to Paul Francois.
Really enjoyed the panel. Really enjoyed Ali's images of the artworks, Ikra's reflections on what it means to be an academic, or being caught between the demands of educational institutions and social movements. And just because I'm interested in religions in particular, Suzanne's paper I thought was really, really fascinating. I'd like to hear more about that. I think, thank you for the pointer to ethopolitics. That's really useful. I guess the reason why we're all in this panel is because we've all spent some time thinking about our positionality, and there aren't any. I mean, I use the word moral, and that's can be a difficult word sometimes because it sometimes implies absolute responses or absolute solutions or answers to ethical questions or ethical problems that we face in the world today. And of course, there aren't any answers like that. We're always operating on the fly. We always have to make pragmatic choices and develop solutions as we go in the context that we're in. I think that I'm currently trying to put a research proposal together on disinformation after the Marcos victory in the recent presidential elections in the Philippines. What was interesting to me about that was that the Catholic Church issued a very strong condemnation of disinformation. And I think what those of us who look at religion often find is, on the one hand, there are those cliches of religious institutions as being conservative, backward-looking. At the same time, not all the time, of course, but at the same time, some of the time, they're also the places which are offering cover for against the overreach of autocratic or authoritarian states, and I think that's the kind of spaces that create are difficult to navigate, but very important. I think that's enough from me. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Ali, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the fantastic questions. The first, I want to respond about my identity. I'm full-time academia actually, but I try to make like the third space to bring together between academia and artists. So maybe one day I will be an artist, but not now. Okay, and the second question is about the misal de Sertu, about the individual movement and tactic strategy. I think that basically street art is very inclusive and everybody can join and participate in this art production. So I can, it's very possible for everybody to participate in this project, and then they can appreciate and they can share or spread the message of the street art pieces, for example, into social media, for example, and it can influence the broader audience. And for the surface of a city, I want to talk about the type of street art, because it is not only mural or stencil that use city's wall, but we can use like street installation or street performance, for example. So we can use several mediums in the city to be the street art medium. In the rural area, based on my previous research in Geneng Street Art Project, the street art used the house wall of the villagers. So it is interesting because so the villagers has have their own street art pieces on their wall. So it changed their habit to be art appreciator, because they have their own pictures or painting on their wall. And yes, I think that's the question. Sorry, maybe I didn't answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Before letting Susanne in, I would like to read an additional question that came up in the chat. It's from Susanne. Let's see. It's from Mary Rakelis. She asked for you, Susanne. Fascinating presentation. Have you connected the most current expressions of right among Vietnamese Catholics within the strong push of Pope Francis towards environmental justice? That is, how significant is the Vatican's view for Vietnamese Catholics as expressed by the head of the Catholic Church? So that is the final questions, and now we close down the chat. Well, I can see that Gabriel raises his hands. I think that we have to extend this panel for 5 minutes. So I'm sorry for this. Gabriel, do you want to say something before I let Susanne in?
No, it's not me. It's Agnello.
Agnello, do you want to say something before?
Oh yeah, I just want to ask a short question to Susanne about, do you think that there is this Catholic movement has rise in Vietnam, and so because there is a similar to idea of loyalty between Catholic and socialist in a such way they speak more or less in the similar words, for example, same rise, but in different physiology. Do you think there's a connection, and is it just a different narration of an idea that in Vietnam already is in the government actually? What do you think? I mean, what is the main difference between the socialist and the Catholic approach? Thank you.
Okay, so that was the last question for today, and we have now the last answer for today. I let you in, Susanne.
Okay, it's impossible to respond actually, but I will try. In terms of ethical towards whom? So I think, first of all, we need to avoid a very or temporary fixed idea of, you know, siding with one group or one subject. That is, I think, not the right approach. What we always need to integrate into that equation of, you know, that will lead us to the answer of ethical towards whom is what levels are we analyzing, what time are we analyzing, and what urgency is there in the field. So it all responds to the changing dynamics of power relations, I would say. So we should always side with a group that is clearly on the side that is not on the powerful. But it can change, of course. And the Catholic example, the example of Catholicism in Vietnam illustrates that so clearly, that the shifting role of the communists, the shifting role of the Catholics makes us shift our position as well in terms of ethics, I guess. So we need to be open to shift our ethical position. That's what I want to say. In terms of the questions or the questions regarding to comparisons to Polish or Latin American and other Southeast Asian countries, I haven't looked into it, but I suppose that there are many similarities in terms of practice. So we find Catholic trade unions, we will find Catholic journals, we will find different or similar ideas of, social justice, of truth, of human rights, of siding with the poor, which is inherent in Catholic theology itself. So in that sense, we will always find similarities. Whether there are similarities in, practical terms, as in, are there, is there exchange of ideas? There, I'm not sure. I can't say anything about it. When it comes to the liberation theology school that was developed in Latin America, there have been some exchanges during the early years of the of Vietnam's communist rule, and the last years towards the end of colonialism, where that dissident groups, I couldn't talk about it, were inspired by liberation theologist ideas. But one of the priests that I've met from that old generation, who's still active in Vietnam, he said it was interesting to see the common and the shared values between Marxism or socialism and Christianity. But he said it's too far away. It doesn't fit. Like geographically, it's too far away to really make that a case for Vietnamese themselves. And I guess that maybe there wasn't the emotional connection maybe is not missing, or the cultural connection is not there. I'm not sure, but maybe Paul François can say something about it, or we can talk about it at some point. I would love to. I think that I don't want to say anything else. There's so much to talk about, of course, but I would be so happy to talk in a different format, maybe more extensively.
Thank you all. Thank you for the interesting questions and the interesting answers. And this means that we will end the session today. And we have digged into various aspects of being a critical scholar, right? We had discussed self-making and existing hierarchies within academia, various moral issues and affect. And I have learned a lot, and I hope that you have done so too. And by this, I will now end this session today. And a big applaud, of course, to all our presenters who've done excellent work. And thank you.